Welcome to the What is Stoicism podcast.
In his discourses, the ancient Stoic teacher Epictetus tells us that as rational beings, nothing distresses us as much as what is unreasonable, and nothing attracts us as much as what is reasonable. This sounds obvious initially, but because people's views of what's reasonable and unreasonable differ, we need to learn how to determine which is which for ourselves. Epictetus uses the following example to show how we weigh up the external circumstances and our own role in such a dilemma. Quote, "For one person it's reasonable to fetch someone else's chamber pot because he's focused on the fact that if he doesn't do it, he'll be flogged and denied food, while if he does, nothing unpleasant or painful will happen to him. But another person not only considers it unbearable to do that, but can't stand even the idea of someone else's doing it. So if you ask me, should I or shouldn't I fetch the chamber pot, I'll reply that being fed is preferable to being denied food, and that being thrashed is less preferable than not being thrashed, and that, therefore, if these are the criteria by which you measure what's in your interest, you should go and fetch it." End quote. Epictetus then has advice for the student who objects to such logic. Quote, "But that's not the kind of person I am. That's something for you, not me, to take into account in your deliberations. After all, you're the one who knows himself, which is to say you know how much you're worth to yourself and at what price you sell yourself. The price differs for different people." End quote. In other words, it's up to us to get to know ourselves. It's up to us to know the principles by which we live, and by extension, what we find reasonable and unreasonable. Concluding this particular lesson, Epictetus cautions us against comparing our worth to that of others. We shouldn't be discouraged by the seemingly unattainable standards of our role models. Rather, we should use them as inspiration to keep improving as much as we possibly can. Quote, "But it may be that exceptional greatness belongs to others, to Socrates and others like him. So if we're equipped by our natures for greatness, why don't all of us, or even many of us, achieve it? Does every horse turn out swift? Does every hound become a good hunter? Well then, am I to stop trying just because I lack natural ability? Perish the thought. Epictetus will be a greater man than Socrates, but I'm satisfied with his not being too bad. I won't be the wrestler Milo either, but that doesn't mean I neglect my body. Nor will I be the wealthy king Croesus, but that doesn't mean I neglect my possessions. In short, in any field of endeavour, we don't let the recognition that we won't reach the peak make us stop trying." Looking at the example of Socrates more closely, when the philosopher went on trial for impiety and for corrupting the minds of the youth of Athens, he chose to speak honestly on his own behalf, rather than present clever arguments that could potentially have seen him acquitted. He staunchly defended his practice of philosophy, unconcerned that for such a principled stance, he would likely have to pay the ultimate price. When asked why he couldn't just keep quiet and increase his chances of avoiding the harshest punishment of all, Socrates explained his reasoning as follows, quote, "For if I tell you that to do as you say would be a disobedience to the god, and therefore that I cannot hold my tongue, you will not believe that I am serious. And if I say again that daily to discourse about virtue, and of those other things about which you hear me examining myself and others, is the greatest good of man, and that the unexamined life is not worth living, you are still less likely to believe me." End quote. This passage continues to provide instruction for us today, as it has done for so many over the years. It reflects our efforts each day to live an examined life, and strive toward virtue, the greatest good of man, as Socrates and the Stoics believed. As we know, Socrates was ultimately sentenced to death. He didn't direct outbursts or insults at those who condemned him, however. Instead, he offered advice. Quote, "If you think that by killing men you can prevent someone from censuring your evil lives, you are mistaken. That is not a way of escape, which is either possible or honourable. The easiest and the noblest way is not to be disabling others, but to be improving yourselves. This is the prophecy which I utter before my departure to the judges who have condemned me." End quote. Again, we're reminded of one of the values that guide us in our practice of philosophy. The noblest way to prevent the disdain of others is not to silence them, but to minimize the things we say and do that could be regarded with disdain. Like Socrates, when we know what we're striving toward, when we know what is reasonable and unreasonable to us, and when we know the principles we're following to get there, it's easier to stay on that path, unmoved by the people and circumstances that try to divert us.